There is a stone slab in the Egyptian desert half buried beneath centuries of dust, its surface still holding the faint impression of a measurement that no surviving text explains. No one carved a name beside it. No king claimed it. It simply rests there in the dim light before dawn, cool to the touch, precise to the millimetre waiting, as it has waited for longer than any dynasty can remember. Run your fingers across its edge. Feel the silence pressed into its grain. That silence is not emptiness, it is patience. You're not here by accident. Something older than curiosity brought you to this moment, a rhythm you have felt before, but never named. The same rhythm that guided hands across stone thousands of years before the first alphabet was scratched into clay. The same rhythm that aligned monuments to stars on opposite sides of the earth in cultures that shared no language, no trade, no memory of each other. And yet they remembered the same angles, the same proportions, the same ancient discipline carved into rock and left without explanation. We are taught that civilization is a line, that it begins in mud and climbs toward light, that each generation builds faithfully upon the last in steady ascent. But what if that line is an illusion drawn by the survivors? What if civilization is not a line at all but a circle, rising, collapsing, scattering its knowledge like ash across the wind, only to be gathered again by hands that no longer remember where it came from? What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern, one that repeats in stone and shadow across continents and millennia, in the quiet spaces between what history records and what the earth remembers. Stay with me. Let's drift a little deeper. Somewhere beneath the surface of everything you have ever been taught about history, there is a layer of the world that does not speak in names or dates, but in temperature, in texture, in the weight of air pressing against stone that has not moved for 10,000 years. Imagine, if you will, a place that exists before any map was drawn, not a country, not a kingdom, but a condition of the earth itself. The hour is late. The sky above you holds no city light, no satellite trail, no aircraft hum. It holds only the ancient scatter of stars arranged in patterns that were old before any human tongue gave them names. The darkness is not absence here. It is presence. It is the original atmosphere of the world, the one that existed when stone was first shaped by hands, that understood something we have since forgotten. Begin at the bottom of the ocean, where the continental shelf drops away into a darkness so complete that light has never touched it, where the water is 4 degrees above freezing, and the pressure would crush a human rib cage into the width of a closed fist. Down here, buried beneath centuries of silt and the slow rain of organic matter drifting from the sunlit world above, there are shapes that do not belong to geology alone. Straight edges, right angles, surfaces too flat to be the work of current or erosion. Sonar pulses have mapped them in fragments off the coast of Japan, beneath the shallow waters of the Bahamas, along the drowned shelves of India's western coastline. These shapes sit in silence, unvisited, unexplained, covered by the patient accumulation of time measured not in years but in the settling rate of marine snow. The ocean floor is the Earth's longest memory. It does not forget. It buries. Now rise slowly the way a diver ascends to avoid the blood turning to foam, and let the water grow warmer by fractions of a degree with each passing metre. Let the pressure release its grip on your chest. Let the blue deepen from black to indigo, to the impossible turquoise of shallow reef water where sunlight finally returns, filtered through salt and plankton into something that feels less like illumination, and more like the earth breathing light back into itself. Break the surface. Feel the air against wet skin. Somewhere ahead, a coastline that once stood 40 metres above you now lies just at the waterline, half swallowed by a rise in sea level so slow that no single generation ever noticed it happening. The beach you are looking at is not the original beach. The original beach is behind you, deep beneath the waves, along with everything that was ever built upon it. This is what loss looks like when it moves at the speed of geology. It does not crash, it absorbs. Step inland now. The ground beneath your feet changes from sand to clay to the dark laterite soil of a tropical forest floor where the canopy above is so dense that noon looks like dusk, and dusk looks like the inside of a closed eye. The air here is thick, warm, saturated with moisture that clings to skin and leaf alike without distinction. Every surface is a live bark, furred with moss roots wrapped in fungal threads, soil permeated with the slow chemical conversation between decay and growth that has been running without interruption for longer than any civilization has existed. The temperature holds steady at 27 degrees day and night, season after season, because the forest regulates itself the way a body regulates its own blood heat. This is not wilderness in the way modern language uses the word. This is a system so old and so deeply self-referencing that it has become its own kind of intelligence. Beneath the leaf litter, beneath the topsoil, beneath the clay, there are stones arranged in ways that the forest has swallowed but not dissolved. Platforms, foundations, walls reduced to their lowest courses, visible only when a river shifts its bed, or a tree falls, and tears a window into the subsoil. The jungle does not care who built them. The jungle only knows that stone endures, and so the jungle builds around it, over it, through it, turning human intention into root and shadow. Travel further now, not in distance but in temperature. Let the warmth drain from the air degree by degree. Let the green fade to brown, the brown to grey, the grey to the blue-white silence of a glacial landscape, where nothing grows and nothing moves except the ice itself, advancing and retreating at a pace so slow it makes continental drift look hurried. Here at the edge of a retreating glacier in the highlands of southern Peru or in the scarred valleys of central Turkey, the ice has been pulling back for 12,000 years, and as it withdraws it reveals what it carried forward in its body boulders transported hundreds of kilometres from their origin rock faces polished to a mirror finish, by millennia of frozen pressure and occasionally rarely unmistakably stones that bear the marks of human shaping. Grooves too regular to be glacial scoring. Flat surfaces too precise to be fracture planes. These stones were worked by someone, placed by someone, and then the ice came and took them into its slow embrace and carried them forward through time the way a river carries sediment without intention, without memory, but with absolute fidelity to the physics of movement and weight. Erosion is time thinking, and the glacier thinks in millennia. This is the atmosphere of the deep past, not a single place, but a condition that stretches from ocean trench to mountain ice, from jungle floor to open desert, from the silence beneath the waves to the silence above the snowline. It is an atmosphere defined not by what is present, but by what is missing. The voices are gone, the names are gone, the languages that once described these places and the people who shaped them have dissolved into the same silence that swallows all sound eventually. What remains is physical, stone, angle, alignment, weight. The deep past communicates through mass and position, through the relationship between a carved surface and the star it once pointed toward, through the temperature at which a kiln-fired blade was hardened, through the precise flatness of a foundation that has supported weight for longer than any written record can account for. And tonight, as the world outside your window settles into its own quiet darkness, you're entering that atmosphere. Not as an archaeologist or a historian or a theorist, but as a listener, someone willing to sit with the silence long enough to notice what it contains. The night around you is not so different from the night that surrounded those unnamed builders, as they laid stone against stone in the hours before dawn, guided by stars that have since shifted their positions by degrees so small that only centuries of patient observation could detect the drift. The air you breathe carries the same nitrogen, the same oxygen, the same trace of argon that filled the lungs of every human who ever lifted a block, sighted a line, or measured an angle against the horizon. The atmosphere has not changed. Only the memory has thinned, so let the night settle. Let the weight of quiet press gently against your awareness, the way deep water presses against a diver's chest, not to harm, but to hold. Somewhere beneath the surface of this silence, the evidence is waiting. It has been waiting for a very long time. It is patient in the way that only stone and starlight can be patient, and it does not need you to believe anything. It only needs you to stay still long enough to feel the texture of what remains when everything else, every name, every banner, every border, every claim of ownership has finally fallen away. Gravity is memory, and memory tonight is pulling you downward into the oldest story the earth still knows how to tell. Evidence does not arrive the way discovery stories suggest sudden dramatic, accompanied by the gasp of revelation and the flash of cameras in a dusty tomb. Real evidence accumulates the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a still lake grain by grain, season by season so slowly that no single deposit seems significant until you drill a core through the full depth and hold 10,000 years of quiet accumulation in your hands. The evidence for a forgotten chapter of human knowledge works the same way. No single artifact proves it. No single site confirms it. But when you lay the fragments side by side, arranged not by culture or continent, but by the quality of the questions they refuse to answer, a rhythm begins to emerge, faint, patient, and older than any explanation currently offered for it. Begin with stone. Not the grand monuments that attract tourists and documentaries, but the quiet, almost invisible precision found in the earliest layers of construction, at sites so old that their original builders have no names. Giza core samples drilled into the limestone bedrock beneath the Great Pyramid reveal levelling marks, shallow cuts made to flatten the surface before anything was built upon it. These cuts extend beyond the footprint of the pyramid itself, suggesting that the plateau was prepared as a single unified surface, not in isolated patches corresponding to individual structures. The flatness achieved across this surface deviates by less than 2 centimeters over an area spanning more than 5 hectares. This is not an approximation, it is a specification, and it appears in the archaeological record without any surviving description of how it was accomplished, without any training manual, without any intermediate attempt that shows the technique being learned through trial and visible error. The precision is simply there, fully formed like a word spoken in the middle of a sentence whose beginning was never recorded. Move to alignment. The 3 major pyramids at Giza are oriented to true north, with a deviation of less than 4 arc minutes, a margin so small that it exceeds the accuracy of many modern structures, built with laser-guided instruments and satellite correction. Egyptologists have proposed methods involving circumpolar star observation, shadow casting, and solar transit tracking, and each method works in theory, but none has been confirmed by any surviving instructional text from the Old Kingdom. The knowledge appears, performs at its highest level, and then gradually degrades in the later centuries as subsequent builders attempt similar orientations with diminishing success. Pyramids constructed after the 4th dynasty drift further from true north. Casing stones grow rougher, internal chambers simplify. The trajectory is not upward from crude to refined, as one would expect from a civilization inventing techniques for the first time. The trajectory is downward from an early peak toward gradual loss. This is what inheritance looks like when the chain of transmission begins to thin. The first generation remembers everything. The 5th remembers most. The 10th remembers the shape but not the reason. The 20th remembers only that the shape mattered. Now cross the ocean. In the highlands of Peru at altitudes where the air is thin enough to make breathing a conscious act, walls, built from polygonal stone blocks, stand fitted together without mortar, each stone uniquely shaped and interlocking with its neighbours in patterns so complex that no 2 joints are identical. These walls have survived centuries of seismic activity, not by resisting earthquakes, but by absorbing them. The stones shift slightly during tremors and then resettle into their original positions, a behaviour that requires not only geometric precision, but an understanding of how stone behaves under dynamic stress. Later, Inca builders constructed walls beside these older foundations, using rectangular blocks and visible mortar, a simpler and less resilient method. The contrast is immediate and physical. You can place your hand on the older wall and feel the seamlessness of the joints, then move your hand to the newer wall and feel the gaps. The older work is superior. This is not opinion. It is measurement, and it appears without a single name date or inscription to explain who achieved it or how. Travel east to Baalbek in modern Lebanon, where the foundations of a Roman temple complex rest upon stones so large that their transport and placement remain unexplained by any Roman engineering text. 3 blocks known as the Trilithon weigh approximately 800 tons each. A 4th block, still partially attached to the quarry floor nearby, weighs an estimated 1,200 tons. Roman engineers documented their methods extensively. They wrote about cranes, pulleys, ramps, and the organisation of labour with characteristic precision, yet they wrote nothing about how these particular stones were moved. The silence is not incidental. It suggests that the Romans did not move them. The Romans built on top of what was already there, the way a bird builds a nest in the hollow of a tree it did not carve. The foundation predates the temple. The evidence is in the stone itself, in the weathering patterns that differ between the lower megalithic blocks and the upper Roman construction, in the tool marks that do not match Roman chiselling techniques, in the sheer impracticality of quarrying and transporting blocks of this mass using any method documented in the classical world. Return now to the quieter evidence, the kind that does not photograph well but accumulates with the patience of dust settling on a library shelf. Measurement systems. The Egyptian royal cubit, standardized to approximately 52.4 centimeters, appears in architectural proportions across thousands of years of construction, with a consistency that implies not gradual agreement, but inherited specification. When this unit is compared to the measurement system of the Indus Valley civilization, and to certain Mesopotamian standards, the ratios between them interlock with a precision that exceeds what independent invention would normally produce. These cultures were separated by thousands of kilometers by different languages, different ecologies, different social structures. Yet their units of measurement relate to one another as if calibrated against a shared reference, a reference that no surviving text from any of these civilizations describes or names. The evidence does not shout. It hums. It hums at a frequency so low that you must be very still to hear it. And then there is the sky. Temples and monuments across the ancient world are oriented not randomly, but towards specific celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising of particular stars at particular dates. Some of these alignments no longer correspond to the current positions of the stars they target, because the Earth's axial precession has shifted the celestial map by degrees that accumulate over centuries. When astronomers calculate backward to determine when these alignments were accurate, the dates they arrive at often predate the cultures conventionally credited with building the structures. The stones point to a sky that no longer exists. They remember a configuration that the builders of the historical period never saw. This mismatch is not an error. It is a timestamp written in angle and orientation rather than ink and papyrus, and it points consistently backward further than the textbooks are comfortable reaching, further than the silence is willing to explain. This is the nature of the evidence. It does not present itself as proof of a single dramatic claim. It presents itself as accumulation, layer upon layer upon layer, each too thin to bear the weight of certainty alone, but together forming a stratum so dense and so consistent that ignoring it requires more effort than acknowledging it. The evidence is patient. It has outlasted every civilization that ever tried to explain it, and every civilization that tried to ignore it. It does not argue. It remains. And remaining in the vocabulary of deep time is the strongest argument there is. There is a moment in every careful examination of the past when the evidence stops cooperating with the story it is supposed to support. It is not a dramatic rupture. It is more like a hairline fracture in a load-bearing wall, invisible from a distance, easy to overlook if you are not pressing your fingers against the surface, but unmistakable once you feel it. The crack does not announce itself. It simply refuses to close. And once you have noticed it, you begin to see others running in parallel tracing lines through the structure of accepted history that converge on a single quiet question: what if the sequence we have been taught is not wrong but incomplete? What if the story does not begin where we have been told it begins? The anomaly at Giza is not the size of the pyramids. Size can be explained by ambition and labour. The anomaly is the inversion of skill. In almost every known tradition of construction technique improves over time. Early attempts are rough. Later attempts refine. Mastery develops through generations of accumulated error and correction, each builder learning from the failures of the last. At Giza, this progression runs backward. The Great Pyramid attributed to the 4th dynasty represents the highest point of precision logistics and material knowledge in the entire Egyptian building tradition. Pyramids built afterward during the 5th and 6th dynasties are smaller, less accurately aligned, rougher in their casing, and simpler in their internal architecture. The decline is not sudden. It is gradual, steady, and unmistakable, like a signal fading as you move away from its source. This is the anomaly. Mastery appears at the beginning. The learning curve is inverted, and no surviving text explains how a civilization achieved its greatest technical feat at the moment it supposedly began attempting such feats for the first time. The crack in the wall runs deep here. Press your fingers against it. Feel it widen, move deeper into the structure itself. The king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid is lined with granite blocks transported from Aswan nearly 900 kilometers to the south. These blocks are cut with a flatness measurable in thousandths of an inch. The interior corners meet at angles so precise that inserting a razor blade between them is difficult. The sarcophagus within the chamber appears to have been hollowed out with a method that left circular tool marks consistent with a tubular drill, a tool for which no physical example has been found in any Old Kingdom archaeological context. Experiments using copper tubes and abrasive sand, the materials conventionally assumed to have been available, can produce similar marks, but only under ideal laboratory conditions with constant pressure, unlimited time, and modern understanding of the process. The original work was done inside a stone chamber at height, within a structure already under construction. The gap between what the tools could theoretically do and what the stone actually shows is the anomaly. It does not disprove any particular theory. It simply sits there unexplained like a word in a sentence that belongs to a different language. Cross the Mediterranean to Malta, where megalithic temples dating to approximately 3600 BCE stand in configurations that predate both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids by centuries. The temples at Hagarkim and Najdra use corbelled stone roofing, precise solar alignments, and curved interior chambers that required an understanding of load distribution and acoustics. The culture that built them left no writing, no metal tools, and no evidence of contact with any other monumental building tradition. The temples appear fully developed in the archaeological record. There is no visible sequence of experimentation leading to their construction, no smaller prototypes, no failed attempts preserved in the soil nearby. And then around 2500 BCE, the culture vanishes. The temples continue to stand, but the people who built them leave no successors, no descendants carrying the tradition forward. The knowledge arrives complete and departs without explanation. Like a traveller who passes through a village, builds something extraordinary and moves on before dawn without leaving a name. In Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, monumental stone pillars carved with animal reliefs were erected around 9600 BCE, roughly 7,000 years before the construction of the Great Pyramid and 6,000 years before the invention of the pottery wheel. The site was built by people who, according to conventional timelines, should have been simple hunter-gatherers without the social organization or surplus resources necessary for large-scale construction. The pillars weigh up to 20 tons. They are arranged in concentric circles with clear astronomical orientation. The carvings are not crude. They are deliberate, stylized, and consistent across multiple construction phases. And then around 8000 BCE, the entire complex was intentionally buried, carefully filled with soil and rubble, as if someone wanted to preserve it by hiding it from the surface world. This act of deliberate concealment is itself an anomaly. Burial requires as much coordinated effort as construction. It implies that the site held value beyond its immediate use, that someone believed it was worth protecting across time, rather than simply abandoning it to decay. The question that Göbekli Tepe poses is not architectural. It is sequential. How does monumental construction appear before agriculture, before pottery, before settled villages? The conventional timeline places these developments in a specific order: farming first, then surplus, then specialization, then monuments. Göbekli Tepe reverses this order entirely. The monument came first, the reason came later. Or perhaps the reason was already ancient, carried forward from a context that no longer survives in the record. These anomalies do not cluster in a single region or a single century. They appear across continents and across millennia, connected not by cultural exchange, but by structural similarity, the same inversion, the same sudden competence, the same silence where explanation should be. In Japan, underwater formations off the coast of Yonaguni display right angles, stepped terraces and flat surfaces that some geologists attribute to natural fracture patterns. and others argue bear unmistakable signs of human modification. The debate remains unresolved because the evidence resists clean categorization. It sits precisely on the boundary between natural and artificial, between coincidence and intention, and the boundary itself is the anomaly. Nature does not often produce right angles in series. Human hands do not often work beneath 60 feet of ocean water, and something does not fit, and the discomfort of that misfit, the quiet friction it generates against the smooth surface of accepted narrative, is exactly the texture of a crack that has been present for a very long time, waiting not for proof, but for patience, the patience to sit with what does not resolve, to hold the question open without forcing it shut, and to recognize that the deepest truths in the archaeological record may not be the ones that answer questions, but the ones that make the old answers insufficient. There is a kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the absence of record. It is the silence that fills the space between what happened and what was written down, between the event and the account, between the hand that shaped the stone and the text that claimed to explain why. This silence is not empty. It is full of time, full of action, full of lives lived, and knowledge practiced, and landscapes crossed, and children taught, and seasons turned. It is full the way deep water is full, dense pressurized, containing more than the surface reveals, carrying weight that can only be felt when you descend far enough to meet it. The silence in the archaeological record is not a gap. It is a presence, and learning to read it may be more important than reading the words that eventually replaced it. Consider what is missing from the story of ancient Egypt. The pyramids stand, the temples endure, the hieroglyphs survive on walls and papyrus. But behind all of this, behind the dynasty lists, the offering formulas, the carefully recorded reigns of kings, there is a vast unwritten territory that the texts themselves acknowledge but do not describe. The Palermo stone, one of the oldest surviving royal annals, lists rulers who reigned before the first dynasty, in periods stretching hundreds of years per reign. Egyptologists interpret these figures as mythological or symbolic, and perhaps they are. But the Egyptians who carved the stone did not distinguish between myth and history the way modern scholarship does. To them the deep past was real. It was simply unreachable. The silence before the dynasties was not ignorance. It was distance, the kind of distance that turns mountains into blue outlines on the horizon, still visible but no longer navigable on foot. The Egyptians knew something had come before. They simply could not describe it in the language of kings and dates. So they described it in the language of God's floods, and the first time a phrase that appears again and again in Egyptian texts pointing backward toward a moment of original order that no human memory could fully recover. The Edfu building texts offer another window into this silence. Preserved on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, these inscriptions describe a time before the current world when divine beings established sacred structures according to cosmic measures, before floods reshaped the land, and before human kingship began. The language is mythological, but the structure is architectural. The texts describe foundations being laid, proportions being set, orientations being fixed. They speak of a plan that existed before the builders, a design inherited rather than invented. Modern scholars typically classify these texts as religious literature, and they are correct to do so. But religious literature in ancient Egypt was not fiction. It was the vessel into which pre-literate memory was poured when writing finally became available. The silence before writing did not vanish when writing arrived. It was translated imperfectly, incompletely, but with enough structural fidelity that the outline of something older remains visible beneath the surface of the sacred language, the way the foundations of an earlier temple remain visible beneath the floor of the one built on top of it. The silence extends far beyond Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerian king list records rulers who reigned before the Great Flood for periods of tens of thousands of years. After the flood reign lengths drop sharply to plausible human lifespans. The transition is abrupt, as if a vast stretch of unrecorded time was compressed into a handful of impossibly long reigns, simply because no other framework existed for containing it. The flood itself serves as a boundary marker, the line beyond which memory cannot pass in any orderly fashion. Before the flood time is mythic. After the flood time is historical. The silence lives in the flood. It is the flood. The rising water is not merely a physical event remembered across cultures. It is a metaphor for the rising of forgetting itself, the slow inundation of memory by the passage of time without written record, the submersion of everything that was known but could not be carried forward in words. In India, the concept of the Yuga cycle divides time into 4 ages of decreasing virtue and increasing forgetfulness, each age longer and darker than the one before it. The current age, the Kali Yuga, is described as the age of maximum forgetting, the period furthest from the original knowledge. This framework does not preserve specific events. It preserves the feeling that what was once known has been progressively lost, that each generation inherits less than the one before, that the direction of time is not upward toward improvement, but downward toward thinning. This is not pessimism. It is a description of what happens to knowledge in the absence of writing. Each transmission loses something. Each retelling simplifies. Each migration leaves behind what cannot be carried. The silence grows not because people stop talking, but because the ratio of what is known to what has been lost shifts steadily in favour of a loss. The most striking feature of this silence is not what it conceals, but what it reveals about the nature of the knowledge that preceded it. When writing finally appears in Egypt, in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, it does not describe invention, it describes inheritance. Measurement systems are already standardized, calendars are already functioning, architectural proportions are already fixed. The first written records do not say we have discovered this, they say we are preserving this. The tone is not excitement, but obligation, the obligation of a steward who has been entrusted with something older than themselves and must pass it forward without alteration. This is the voice that emerges from the silence. Not the voice of the inventor, but the voice of the keeper. Not the voice of the one who found the answer, but the voice of the one who received it. Already ancient, already authoritative, already too important to question and too old to explain. The silence between the deep past and the written record is not a void to be filled with speculation. It is a texture to be felt. It has weight. It has density. It has the particular quality of compressed time, the same quality you feel when you hold a piece of sedimentary rock in your hand and realize that each visible layer represents 1,000 years of quiet accumulation, and that the rock itself is nothing more than silence. Made solid, time made touchable, the past pressing its full weight into your open palm and asking not to be explained but simply to be held. There was a world before this one. Not in the language of myth, though myth remembers it. Not in the language of scripture, though scripture echoes its outline. There was a world that existed in the long stretch of time between the retreat of the glaciers and the first scratching of symbols into wet clay, a span of roughly 7,000 years, during which human beings lived, observed, organized, built, lost, migrated, rebuilt, and carried forward fragments of understanding without ever writing a single word. This is the forgotten epoch. It does not appear in textbooks, because textbooks begin where writing begins and writing begins after the epoch had already ended. It does not appear in king lists because there were no kings, or if there were, they called themselves by names that no alphabet preserved. It does not appear on maps because the coastlines it knew are now underwater. The rivers it followed have changed course, and the landmarks it used have been buried beneath millennia of sediment forest growth and the slow rearrangement of the Earth's surface by forces that do not consult human memory before they act. Imagine this world, not as a primitive place, not as a paradise, but as a working landscape, a world in which people understood their environment with a depth and patience that modern civilization, for all its instruments, has largely abandoned. The African humid period lasting from roughly 14,800 BCE to 5,500 BCE transformed North Africa into a green and living territory, crossed by rivers dotted with lakes covered in grassland and light forest. The Sahara was not a desert, it was a homeland. Rock art preserved in the Tassili Nadja plateau of southern Algeria depicts cattle herds, swimmers' boats on open water, and human figures engaged in activities that suggest stable communities with enough surplus time to develop art ritual and social organization. These images were not carved by wandering nomads scratching at stone between hunts. They were carved by people who lived in one place long enough to observe the same stars rising over the same horizon, for generations long enough to notice that certain patterns repeated, and certain cycles could be predicted long enough to begin encoding that knowledge into the orientation of stones, the placement of graves, and the rhythm of ceremonies performed at the same location at the same time year after year after year. At Nabta Playa, deep in what is now the western desert of Egypt, a site that would become uninhabitable, within centuries reveals evidence of astronomical awareness that predates the pyramids by at least 2,000 years. Stone circles erected between 7,000 and 5,000 BCE align with the summer solstice and with the rising points of specific stars. These are not accidental arrangements. The stones were transported, shaped, and placed with deliberate orientation, requiring shared planning and a collective understanding of celestial cycles that extended far beyond the needs of daily survival. What is remarkable about Nabta Playa is not only its age, but its context. The site shows evidence of ritual activity, cattle burials, ceremonial structures, and organized gathering spaces before it shows evidence of agriculture. The usual narrative places farming before astronomy, surplus before sophistication, the stomach before the sky. Nabta Playa reverses this order. The sky came first. The need to understand time, to track its movement, to predict its returns, this was not a luxury that followed abundance. It was a necessity that preceded it. Knowing when the rains would come, when the stars would shift, when the seasons would turn was not an intellectual exercise. It was survival. And survival required observation sustained across lifetimes, transmitted across generations, without the aid of a single written character. Now let this world grow outward in your mind. The people at Nabta Playa were not alone. Across the Sahara, across the Nile corridor, across the coastal plains of the eastern Mediterranean and the river valleys of Anatolia, similar communities existed in similar conditions, stable enough to observe, organized enough to build, connected enough to share. Trade routes linked the Nile Valley to the Red Sea coast, to the highlands of Ethiopia, to the oases of the western desert. Obsidian from Anatolia has been found in settlements along the Nile, evidence of exchange networks that spanned thousands of kilometers before any of these regions developed writing. Shells from the Mediterranean appear in graves deep in the continental interior. These are not isolated curiosities, they are the fingerprints of a connected world. Not a world connected by empire or administration, but a world connected by movement, by the slow migration of people, carrying knowledge in their hands and habits, spreading techniques not through conquest but through contact, through the simple human act of showing someone how something is done and watching them carry it forward. In this forgotten epoch, knowledge was not stored in archives, it was stored in practice. A surveyor did not consult a manual. He repeated what his teacher had shown him, who had repeated what his teacher had shown him in a chain of transmission that stretched back beyond any single memory to an origin that no one could identify but everyone trusted. A builder did not calculate from first principles. She placed stones in the configuration that had always worked, following proportions, inherited from a tradition so old that questioning it would have felt not like innovation but like recklessness. A stargazer did not derive equations. He watched the same patch of sky his grandfather had watched from the same stone platform at the same hour, and noted whether the pattern held or whether something had shifted. Knowledge in this world was not abstract. It was embodied. It lived in the hands, in the eyes, in the rhythm of repeated action. And because it was embodied, it was vulnerable to exactly the kind of disruption that the end of the African humid period would bring. When the rains began to fail, not all at once, but unevenly, region by region, decade by decade, the world that had supported this quiet accumulation of knowledge began to contract. Lakes shrank, rivers thinned, grasslands turned to scrub and scrub turned to sand. Communities that had occupied the same sites for 1,000 years found themselves forced to move, carrying with them whatever knowledge could survive the journey and leaving behind whatever could not. Stone circles remained in the desert. Cattle bones dried in abandoned graves. Rock art faded under the advancing sun. But the people moved toward the Nile, toward the coast, toward the few remaining corridors of green where water still flowed, and the sky still delivered its promises on schedule. They carried their knowledge with them the way a river carries sediment, not all of it, not evenly, but enough to deposit something recognizable on the other side. What arrived at the banks of the Nile was not a civilization. It was the raw material from which a civilization would assemble itself, slowly over centuries, building on fragments of a forgotten epoch that no one alive could fully remember, but no one alive could entirely escape. This is the world that Egypt inherited, not a blank slate, not a sudden invention, a continuation, partial, imperfect, stripped of context, but still carrying the weight of deep time in its measurements, its alignments, and its quiet insistence that certain things must be done in certain ways for reasons that no longer need to be explained, because the explanation was already ancient when the first pharaoh drew breath. The earth breathes. Not in the way lungs breathe, not in seconds, not in rhythms you can count against a pulse. The earth breathes in millennia. Its inhale is the slow accumulation of ice on continental surfaces, the drawing down of sea levels, the expansion of land bridges and coastal plains, the opening of corridors between continents that allow life and knowledge and movement to flow freely across distances that will later become impassable. Its exhale is the melting, the release, the return of water to the oceans, the drowning of lowlands, the severing of connections, the closing of paths that had been open for thousands of years. This exhale is not destruction. It is not punishment. It is not the wrath of gods or the failure of civilizations. It is respiration. The earth adjusting its weight, redistributing its water, resettling into a new configuration, the way a body shifts in sleep slowly, unconsciously, without malice and without mercy. What we call catastrophe, the earth calls breathing. The last great exhale began approximately 12,000 years ago, and continued with surges and pauses for roughly 6,000 years. During this span, global sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. The number is easy to say and almost impossible to feel. 100 meters of vertical rise translates into thousands of kilometers of horizontal coastline retreat in regions where the continental shelf slopes gently, and there are many such regions. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow body of water averaging only 50 meters in depth, was entirely dry land during the glacial maximum. The Sunda Shelf, connecting Southeast Asia to Indonesia and beyond, was a continuous landmass larger than modern India. The North Sea, between Britain and continental Europe, was a forested lowland crossed by rivers and inhabited by communities whose tools are still dredged from the seabed by fishing trawlers. The Black Sea, according to some geological models, experienced a catastrophic infill event around 5,600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus threshold and poured into what had been a smaller freshwater lake, raising its level by as much as 60 meters in a geological instant. These are not abstract statistics. These are the shapes of a world being remade by water, slowly in some places, suddenly in others, but everywhere, with the same result: the erasure of the coastal world that had supported human settlement for millennia. Consider what was lost. Not in terms of monuments or artifacts, though, those were lost too. Consider what was lost in terms of continuity. Coastal settlements were the oldest and most stable human habitations. They offered predictable food sources, shellfish fish, marine mammals, coastal plants that did not depend on the uncertainties of inland hunting or the later development of agriculture. They offered transportation routes along shorelines and up river mouths. They offered the kind of environmental stability that allows knowledge to accumulate across generations without disruption. For tens of thousands of years, these coastal corridors were the arteries of human connection, the pathways along which techniques, materials and ideas travelled between distant groups. When the seas rose, these arteries were severed, not cut cleanly, not all at once, but slowly constricted, narrowed, rerouted, and finally submerged, the way a river silts up over centuries, growing shallower and shallower, until one season it simply does not flow anymore, and the communities that depended on it must find another way or dissolve. The reset was not a single event. It was a process, and like all processes measured in millennia, it contained within it moments of sudden acceleration that would have been experienced by living people as catastrophe. Meltwater pulse events, periods of rapid glacial discharge, produced sea level rises of several meters, within a single century, sometimes within decades. Meltwater Pulse 1a, occurring around 14,600 years ago, may have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 metres in less than 500 years. For a community living on a gently sloping coastal plain, this rate of rise would have been visible within a single lifetime. The fishing ground your grandfather waded to at low tide would be deep water by the time your grandchildren were born. The promontory where ceremonies were held at the solstice would become an island, then a reef, then a memory, then nothing. The experience of watching land disappear beneath water, not in a single flood, but in a slow generational drowning, would leave a mark on collective memory so deep that no amount of subsequent forgetting could fully erase it. And it did leave a mark. It left the same mark on every coastal culture that survived it. It left the flood story. The flood story is not a single narrative. It is a structural pattern that appears across cultures, separated by oceans, languages, and millennia Sumerian, Hebrew, Hindu, Greek, Mesoamerican, Aboriginal, Australian, West African, Chinese. The details differ, the names differ, the moral frameworks differ, but the architecture of the story is remarkably consistent. A world that was known is destroyed by water. A remnant survives carrying essential knowledge. The world is rebuilt from that remnant, diminished but continuous. This is not evidence of a single global flood in the literal sense. It is evidence of a shared human experience, the experience of living through a period in which water reshaped the world so thoroughly that the memory of it became the foundational narrative of loss in nearly every culture that emerged on the other side. The flood is not a myth about water. It is a myth about forgetting. The water is what rises when memory can no longer hold back the weight of what has been lost. What survived the reset was not random. The Earth selected for durability the way a sieve selects for size. Anything built on low ground was taken. Anything built from perishable materials was dissolved. Anything dependent on coastal trade networks was severed from its support system. What remained was what had been built on high ground from stone aligned to features that did not change when the water rose, the stars, the cardinal directions, the angle of the sun at solstice. These surviving fragments became the seeds of what would later be called civilization. But they were not beginnings. They were remainders. They were what was left after the earth exhaled and the water settled and the world grew quiet again. The reset did not end human knowledge. It filtered it. It stripped away context and left only the most durable core, the measurements, the alignments, the proportions, the practices so deeply embedded in habit that they could survive the loss of everything that once explained them. What emerged from the reset was not a new species of knowledge. It was the skeleton of an older one, still standing, still functional, but stripped of the flesh of meaning that had once given it life. And in the stillness that followed in the long quiet centuries after the seas stabilized, and the new coastlines hardened and the forests reclaimed the mudflats, and the rivers found their new courses, people began to rebuild. Not from nothing, never from nothing. From the bones of what the water had spared, from stone that still pointed north, from calendars that still predicted the flood, from proportions that still held weight without cracking. The reset was not an ending. It was a breath, and after the breath the earth settled, and the long work of remembering what could be remembered began again in the silence that always follows an exhale, the silence that is not empty but waiting, not dead but resting, holding in its stillness the faintest outline of everything that came before, the way the shore holds the shape of a wave long after the water is withdrawn. Nothing truly disappears. This is not a spiritual claim or a comforting abstraction. It is a physical fact observable at every scale from the molecular to the continental. Energy does not vanish. It transforms. Heat becomes motion. Motion becomes sound. Sound becomes vibration in a surface that holds the tremor long after the air has gone still. The past works the same way. It does not end. It echoes. And if you know how to listen, not with urgency, not with the need to prove anything, but with the slow attention of someone sitting in a quiet room, waiting for the walls to speak, you begin to hear it everywhere. In the angle of a foundation, in the rhythm of a calendar, in the shape of a word whose meaning has changed but whose sound has not. The echo of the forgotten epic did not fade when writing began. It was absorbed into the structures that writing would later describe without recognizing their origin. Begin with architecture. Across the ancient world, certain proportions repeat with a consistency that defies coincidence and resists explanation. The ratio of height to base in the Great Pyramid approximates the relationship between a circle's radius and its half circumference, a mathematical correspondence that encodes the value of pi in stone without any surviving Egyptian text acknowledging that such a constant was known or deliberately employed. This same proportional awareness appears in the layout of Angkor Wat, where the temple complex mirrors the constellation Draco as it appeared in the sky around 10,500 BCE, a date thousands of years before the temple was constructed in the 12th century CE. The builders of Angkor did not invent this alignment. They inherited it transmitted through a chain of tradition so long that its origin had dissolved into religious symbolism by the time it was finally set in stone. The echo does not explain itself. It simply repeats, and each repetition carries the faintest residue of the original signal, diminished but structurally intact the way a bell continues to hum long after the hand that struck it has pulled away. Consider the echo in language. The Egyptian word for surveying harpedon aptae refers to rope stretchers teams of specialists who used calibrated cords to re-establish field boundaries after the annual Nile flood. This practice was not invented during the dynastic period. It was already formalized, already ritualized, already embedded in the administrative and religious fabric of Egyptian life by the time any text described it. The word itself is a fossil preserving the outline of a technique whose origin predates the language that named it. Across the Mediterranean, Greek geometry inherits its foundational concepts from Egypt. Thales, Pythagoras, and later Euclid all acknowledged Egyptian sources. Yet the Egyptians themselves attributed their knowledge not to human discovery, but to divine transmission to Thoth, the god of measurement and writing, who did not invent knowledge but delivered it from an older order. The echo travels through language the way vibration travels through stone, not as content but as structure, not as meaning but as shape. The echo lives in the body as well. Modern humans carry genetic markers that trace migration patterns stretching back tens of thousands of years. Haplogroups map the movement of populations from Africa into the Middle East across the coastal plains of southern Asia, through the island chains of Southeast Asia, and into the Pacific northward into Europe, and eventually across the land bridge into the Americas. These genetic trails are not stories in the conventional sense, but they carry information about timing, direction, and the branching paths of human dispersal that align with the environmental changes of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. The same populations that carried genes across continents also carried knowledge techniques for working stone methods, for reading the sky habits of measurement and proportion that did not require language to transmit because they were embedded in practice rather than speech. The genetic echo and the cultural echo travelled the same roads, carried by the same feet, shaped by the same pressures of climate, geography and survival. Listen for the echo in ritual. Across cultures that share no historical contact, certain ceremonial patterns recur with unsettling regularity. The solstice is marked. The equinox is honoured. The dead are oriented towards specific cardinal directions. Stone is placed in circles. Fire is carried through darkness at the turning of the year. These practices did not spread through conquest or colonization. They arose from a shared inheritance of observation, from the fact that all human beings, regardless of continent or century, live beneath the same sky and respond to the same cycles of light and darkness, growth and decay, warmth and cold. But the specificity of some of these echoes suggests more than parallel invention. The angle at which a burial is oriented, the precise number of stones in a circle, the particular star whose rising triggers a particular ceremony. These details carry the fingerprints of transmission rather than independent discovery of knowledge passed hand to hand, across distances so great and time spans so long that the original context has evaporated entirely, leaving only the practice itself hollow of explanation, full of repetition, preserved not because it is understood, but because stopping it feels more dangerous than continuing. The echo is loudest in the places where the earth itself has been most stable. Egypt, sheltered by desert on two sides and nourished by the predictable rhythm of the Nile, became a resonating chamber for echoes that faded elsewhere. Practices that had been dispersed across the Green Sahara, concentrated along the narrow corridor of the river valley as the desert expanded. Knowledge that had been spread thin across a wide landscape was compressed into a narrow band of habitable ground. And in that compression it intensified the way sound intensifies in a canyon, not because the source is louder, but because the walls are closer. What Egypt preserved was not uniquely Egyptian. It was the accumulated resonance of a much wider world focused by geography into a single surviving tradition that would later be mistaken for a point of origin rather than recognized as a point of collection. Tonight, as the air around you holds its quiet weight and the sounds of the waking world recede into the soft static of rest, consider that you yourself are an echo. Your body carries the genetic memory of every migration your ancestors survived. Your habits of sleeping and waking follow circadian rhythms calibrated to a sun that governed human life long before clocks were invented. Your sense of direction, your response to seasonal change, your instinct to mark the passage of time, these are not modern inventions. They are reverberations of an older signal still travelling through you, still shaping your behaviour in ways too subtle to notice and too ancient to name. The echo does not ask to be heard, it simply continues. And continuing it proves that what came before did not truly end. It thinned, it scattered, it grew quiet, but it never stopped. There is a moment late at night when the mind loosens its grip on the need for straight lines and begins to perceive shapes it normally dismisses. Circles, spirals, returns. The waking mind insists that time moves forward, that history is a road with a beginning and an end, that progress is the natural direction, that what comes after must be more than what came before. But the drowsing mind, the mind that has released the need to organize and allowed itself simply to observe, recognizes something different. It recognizes that the river does not flow in a straight line. It meanders, it curves back on itself. It carves oxbow lakes that hold still water long after the main current has moved on. And sometimes, centuries later, the river returns to the same ground it once abandoned, not because it remembers, but because the shape of the land has not changed, and water given enough time will always find the path of least resistance again. History is not a river in a canal. History is a river in a floodplain. It wanders, it repeats, and if you watch it long enough from high enough, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The pattern is this: complexity rises, peaks, fragments, and disperses. Knowledge accumulates in stable conditions, concentrates in favourable geographies, achieves expression in stone and sky and measure, and then when the conditions that supported it shift beyond recoverable limits, it scatters. Not all of it is lost. Fragments survive, carried forward by migration by habit, by the sheer durability of stone and the reliability of stars. These fragments land in new soil. They take root unevenly. They grow into new forms that resemble the old ones without replicating them, exactly the way a child resembles a grandparent, recognizably connected, undeniably different, carrying inherited features whose origin it cannot explain. And then the cycle begins again. Accumulation, concentration, expression, disruption, dispersal, regathering. It is not a circle in the geometric sense, perfect and closed. It is a spiral returning to the same themes but at a different altitude, each time carrying forward what survived the last turn, while leaving behind what could not make the journey. This pattern is visible at every scale. Within a single civilization, techniques rise to mastery, and then decline as the conditions supporting them erode. In Egypt, the precision of 4th dynasty construction gives way to the rougher work of later periods, not because builders became less intelligent, but because the institutional knowledge, the coordinated labour, and the inherited techniques that produced the Great Pyramid could not be maintained indefinitely in the face of political fragmentation, resource depletion, and the natural entropy that affects all complex systems. The pattern repeats in Mesopotamia, where the sophisticated urban planning of early Sumerian cities degrades over centuries as rivers shift course, and salination poisons the soil that once fed the surplus that once funded the builders. It repeats in the Indus Valley, where the extraordinary standardization of Harappan cities, uniform brick ratios, precise street grids, advanced drainage systems dissolves, after approximately 1900 BCE, into smaller, simpler settlements, that retain fragments of the older order without reproducing its full complexity. The pattern does not care about the names of civilizations. It operates beneath them, through them, indifferent to the banners flying above the walls. At a larger scale, the pattern connects civilizations that conventional history treats as unrelated. The monumental building traditions of Egypt, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley and East Asia share structural features that cannot be explained by direct contact alone. The use of pyramidal forms, the alignment of sacred structures to cardinal directions, the encoding of astronomical cycles in architectural proportion, the reverence for specific numbers and ratios that recur across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. These similarities are not proof of a single source. They are evidence of a shared pattern, the pattern of knowledge rising, scattering and reconverging in multiple locations, simultaneously, each location contributing its own variation while preserving the underlying structure. The pattern is the civilization, not any single expression of it, but the recurring tendency of human knowledge to organize itself around the same principles. Whenever conditions allow the same way, crystals form the same geometric structures, regardless of where the mineral solution happens to cool, because the structure is inherent in the material itself, not imposed from outside. Recognizing this pattern changes the question. Instead of asking, where did civilization begin? The question becomes, where did the pattern last converge, and where will it converge again? Instead of searching for a single origin point, a Garden of Eden, a motherland, a lost continent, the pattern suggests that origin is distributed. Knowledge arises wherever observation is sustained long enough to produce it. It concentrates wherever geography allows it to accumulate. It disperses whenever the environment that supported it changes beyond tolerance, and it reconverges wherever the next stable environment offers refuge. Egypt was one such refuge. The Nile Valley, with its predictable floods, its protective deserts, its north-south corridor connecting tropical Africa to the Mediterranean, this was a place where scattered fragments could settle, combine, and crystallize into the tradition we now call ancient Egyptian civilization. But the fragments did not originate there. They arrived there, carried by people moving out of drying landscapes and drowning coastlines, bringing with them the remnants of a pattern that had already cycled through expression and dispersal at least once before. The pattern does not argue for a lost golden age or a forgotten utopia. It argues for something quieter and more durable, the recognition that human knowledge is not a tower being built upward from the ground, but a tide that rises and falls across a landscape, leaving high water marks on different stones at different times, each mark recording the height that knowledge reached before the tide withdrew. Some marks are faint, some are unmistakable. The pyramids are one such mark, Göbekli Tepe is another. The polygonal walls of Sacsayhuaman, the megaliths of Malta, the stone circles of Nabta Playa. These are all high water marks, records of moments when the tide of knowledge rose to a level that later ages could not sustain and could barely comprehend. The tide does not explain itself. It rises, it leaves its mark, it withdraws. And in the long interval between one high tide and the next, the marks remain silent, precise, waiting for the water to return, waiting for someone to notice that the marks are not random, that they form a line, and that the line is not straight but curved, bending back on itself in a shape that the waking mind calls mystery, and the drowsing mind recognizes at last as a pattern it has always known. The earth does not warn the way humans warn with words, with raised voices, with urgency compressed into the narrow bandwidth of language. The earth warns the way geology warns slowly structurally through changes so gradual that they become visible only in retrospect, only when the core sample is pulled and the layers are read and the story they tell is already thousands of years old. A warning from the earth is not a siren, it is a sediment. It accumulates in lake beds and ice cores and ocean floor deposits, recording shifts in temperature and rainfall, in atmospheric composition, in the subtle chemistry of seawater that reflects the health or illness of systems so vast that no single human lifetime can perceive their full arc. The earth has been warning for as long as it has been breathing. The question has never been whether the warnings exist. The question has always been whether anyone is listening at the right speed. 12,000 years ago, the warning was ice. Continental glaciers that had covered much of North America and northern Europe for tens of thousands of years began to retreat, and the meltwater they released did not flow gently into the sea. It accumulated in vast preglacial lakes, Lake Agassiz, Lake Ojibwe, bodies of fresh water so large that their eventual drainage into the Atlantic altered ocean circulation patterns and triggered rapid climate shifts that rippled across the entire northern hemisphere. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions lasting roughly 1,200 years, may have been triggered by exactly such a freshwater pulse, disrupting the thermohaline circulation that distributes heat from the tropics to the poles. In the span of a few decades, temperatures in parts of Europe dropped by as much as 7 degrees Celsius. Forests retreated, grasslands advanced. Communities that had adapted to warming conditions were forced to readapt to cold, and the knowledge systems that had served them in one climate became unreliable in another. The Earth was not punishing anyone, the Earth was adjusting. But the adjustment experienced at human scale felt like the end of the world, because for the people living through it in every way that mattered to daily survival, it was. The warning was also drought. The end of the African humid period, which had sustained green landscapes across what is now the Sahara for nearly 9,000 years, did not arrive as a single catastrophic event. It arrived as a trend, a slow century-by-century reduction in monsoon rainfall, driven by orbital shifts in the Earth's axial tilt and precession that altered the seasonal distribution of solar energy across the tropics. Lakes that had filled basins in the central Sahara began to shrink. Rivers that had crossed the desert thinned to seasonal streams, and then to dry beds. Vegetation retreated toward the margins, concentrating along the Nile, along the Atlantic coast, along the few remaining corridors where water still flowed reliably. For communities that had lived in the green Sahara for generations, the change was not invisible. They saw the grass thinning. They watched the herds move. They noticed the wells dropping year by year. But the change was slow enough that each generation could adapt incrementally, relocating, slightly adjusting routes, shifting resources, until the cumulative displacement reached a threshold beyond which incremental adaptation was no longer sufficient, and the only remaining option was migration at a scale that severed communities from the landscapes that had defined them. This is the nature of the Earth's warning. It does not arrive at the speed of human attention. It arrives at the speed of climate, which is to say at the speed of centuries, which is to say at a pace so slow that it falls beneath the threshold of urgency and enters the territory of normalcy. Each generation inherits a world slightly different from the one its parents knew, and assumes that this slightly different world is the baseline, the way things have always been. The concept has a modern name, shifting baseline syndrome, but it is as old as human settlement itself. Every generation that watched the Sahara dry a little more believed it had always been approximately this dry. Every generation that watched the coastline creep a little closer believed the sea had always been approximately this high. The warning was continuous. The perception of it was not. And in the gap between continuous signal and intermittent perception, entire landscapes were transformed, entire knowledge systems were stranded, and entire populations were set in motion without fully understanding the scale of the force that moved them. The Earth warned through biology as well. Pollen records extracted from lake sediments and peat bogs reveal shifts in vegetation that precede human responses by centuries. Trees migrate before people do. Grasslands advance before herds follow. The biological clock of a landscape runs ahead of the cultural clock of the communities that inhabit it, and the lag between the two is where loss accumulates. By the time a community recognizes that its environment has changed enough to require relocation, the optimal destination may already be occupied, the intermediate routes may already be degraded, and the knowledge needed to adapt to the new environment may already be fragmentary. The Earth's warning is always early. The human response is almost always late. This asymmetry is not a flaw in human cognition. It is a consequence of the mismatch between the timescale at which environmental change operates and the timescale at which human memory functions. Memory without writing spans 3 to 5 generations at most. Environmental change operates across dozens of generations. The warning outlasts the memory of the warning, and so each cycle of disruption arrives as if it were the first, even when the sediment record clearly shows it is not. There are warnings in the present that rhyme with warnings from the deep past. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica record atmospheric carbon dioxide levels across hundreds of thousands of years, and the current trajectory of those levels has no precedent in the entire span of the ice core record. Sea levels are rising again, not at the catastrophic rate of meltwater pulse 1a, but at a rate that is accelerating decade by decade in a pattern that the geological record associates with the early stages of major marine transgression. Ocean circulation patterns are shifting. Monsoon systems are destabilizing. Permafrost that has been frozen for tens of thousands of years is thawing, releasing methane in quantities that climate models are still struggling to incorporate. These are not predictions. They are measurements. They are the same kind of slow structural signals that preceded every major environmental reorganization in the Holocene record. The Earth is not speaking louder. It is speaking at the same volume it has always used. The question is whether this time anyone is reading the sediment before it becomes the story rather than after. The deep past offers no prescription. It offers precedent. It shows what happens when environmental thresholds are crossed, not what should be done about it, but what has been done and what was lost in the doing. It shows that knowledge can survive extraordinary disruption, but only in fragments. It shows that the most durable knowledge is the knowledge embedded in practice in stone in the alignment of structures to cycles that do not change when the surface world does. It shows that memory without writing compresses long processes into single stories, and that by the time those stories are told, the warning they contain has already been converted from data into myth, from measurement into metaphor, from a signal that could have guided action into a narrative that can only explain loss after the fact. The Earth does not repeat its warnings. It does not need to. The warnings are still present in every core sample, every pollen record, every drowned coastline, every sediment layer that tells the same story in the same patient language of accumulation and change. The Earth is not waiting for us to listen. The Earth is simply continuing to speak at the speed it has always spoken, in a language made not of words but of weight, temperature and time. There is an ancient conversation happening above you right now, conducted in a language so slow that no single human lifetime can hear more than a syllable of it. The sky speaks to the Earth, and the Earth answers, and the exchange has been ongoing for longer than any stone has stood or any ocean has held its current shape. The sun traces its arc from east to west each day, but that arc is not fixed. It migrates north and south across the seasons, reaching its highest point at the summer solstice and its lowest at the winter solstice. And this migration, this slow breathing of light across the surface of the world, is what makes agriculture possible, what makes seasons predictable, what makes calendars meaningful. The moon answers with its own rhythm, a 29.5-day cycle of waxing and waning that governs tides, marks months, and provides a secondary clock that runs slightly out of phase with the solar year, creating a tension between two timekeeping systems that every early civilization had to reconcile. And behind both sun and moon, the stars turn on an axis that itself is turning the Earth's axial precession, a wobble so slow that it completes a single rotation every 26,000 years, shifting the position of the celestial pole, altering which stars rise at which seasons, and gradually rotating the entire frame of reference against which every astronomical observation is made. This is the deep conversation. Sun and moon speak in years. Precession speaks in millennia, and the Earth listens through stone. The relationship between sky and Earth is not metaphorical, it is architectural. Every major ancient monument that has been surveyed with modern instruments reveals deliberate orientation towards celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising or setting of specific stars at specific dates. The Great Pyramid's faces are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of less than 4 arc minutes. The passage inside the Pyramid of Khufu points toward the culmination of Alpha Draconis, the star that served as the celestial North Pole during the 3rd millennium BCE. At Angkor Wat, the spring equinox sunrise aligns precisely with the central tower when viewed from the western entrance. At Newgrange in Ireland, a narrow passage allows sunlight to penetrate the inner chamber only on the winter solstice, illuminating a space that remains in darkness for the remaining 364 days of the year. These alignments are not decorative, they are functional. They anchored human activity to celestial cycles with a precision that ensured their continued relevance across centuries, and in doing so they created a bridge between the impermanence of human life and the permanence of celestial motion. The sky does not forget. By aligning stone to sky, the builders ensured that their knowledge would not forget either, at least not entirely, at least not as long as the stone remained standing and the stars continued to rise. But the sky does move, and this movement is the key to reading the deep past through its monuments. Precession alters the positions of stars relative to the horizon over long periods. A temple aligned to the rising of a particular star at a particular date will remain accurate for only a few centuries before the precessional drift renders the alignment obsolete. When astronomers calculate backward to determine when a given alignment was precise, the dates they arrive at sometimes predate the conventional construction dates of the structures by thousands of years. The Sphinx at Giza, if its eastward orientation is interpreted as an equinoctial alignment, faces the point on the horizon where the constellation Leo rose at the spring equinox, but that alignment was accurate around 10,500 BCE, not during the 4th dynasty, when the Sphinx is conventionally dated. This does not prove that the Sphinx was carved in 10,500 BCE. It suggests that the orientation may have been inherited from an older tradition that remembered a sky the dynastic Egyptians never saw preserved in stone, the way a fossil preserves the shape of an organism that no longer exists in living form. The alignment is a memory. The stone is its medium. The sky is its reference. And the conversation between all three continues whether anyone is listening or not. The Earth answers the sky not only through monuments, but through geology itself. The tilt of the Earth's axis determines the severity of seasons. The eccentricity of its orbit determines the distance from the Sun at different times of year. The precession of the equinoxes determines which hemisphere receives more solar energy during its summer. These three cycles, tilt, eccentricity, and precession, interact over tens of thousands of years to produce the Milankovitch cycles, the slow oscillations in solar energy distribution that drive the advance and retreat of ice ages. The Earth's climate is in this sense a dialogue between orbital mechanics and atmospheric response, between the geometry of the sky and the chemistry of the air and the reflectivity of the surface below. Ice cores record this dialogue in trapped air bubbles that preserve the atmospheric composition of specific centuries. Ocean sediment cores record it in the shells of foraminifera, whose oxygen isotope ratios reflect the temperature of the water they lived in. Tree rings record it in the width of each annual growth band, wider in warm wet years, narrower in cold dry ones. The Earth has been keeping minutes of this conversation for millions of years, filed in ice, in mud, in wood, in stone, waiting to be read by anyone patient enough to learn the language. The ancient builders, whoever they were, appear to have understood at least part of this conversation. Their awareness of precession, a cycle so slow that detecting it requires observation sustained across many generations, suggests a depth of astronomical knowledge that exceeds what casual skywatching could produce. Precession is not obvious. It cannot be noticed in a single lifetime. It reveals itself only through the careful comparison of star positions recorded at long intervals, or through the maintenance of aligned structures that gradually drift out of accuracy in ways that can only be explained by the slow rotation of the celestial frame. The fact that precessional awareness appears encoded in myth and architecture across multiple ancient cultures, in the Hindu concept of the Yuga cycle, in the Mesoamerican long count calendar, in the Egyptian association of cosmic ages with specific celestial configurations, suggests that this knowledge was not independently discovered in each location, but transmitted from a common tradition old enough to have observed the cycle through multiple iterations. This is the deepest echo of the conversation between sky and earth, the recognition that the heavens are not fixed, that even the stars move, that the frame of reference itself is rotating, and that any system of knowledge anchored to the sky must account for this motion, or eventually lose its accuracy. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the ceiling above you becomes a kind of sky in its own right, featureless dark holding the weight of the structure above you, the way the atmosphere holds the weight of everything above it, consider that the same stars visible through your window are the descendants of the stars those ancient builders aligned their stones toward. Not the same positions, the positions have shifted, but the same light, the same nuclear fires, burning at distances so vast that the photons reaching your eyes tonight left their source before any pyramid was planned, before any coastline drowned, before any flood story was told for the first time around a fire whose embers have long since returned to carbon and ash. The sky does not remember the builders. The sky does not remember anything. It simply continues the way a river continues, the way stone continues, the way the conversation between earth and heaven continues in its slow and patient language of angle, light and time. You are lying beneath that conversation now. It does not require your attention, but it accepts it. And in accepting it, it folds you gently into a rhythm older than memory, older than stone, older than the silence itself, the rhythm of a world that has always been speaking to itself, and that tonight, for a little while, is speaking also to you. You have been here before. Not in this room, not in this body, not in this particular arrangement of hours and thoughts and quiet breath, but here in this feeling, the feeling of standing at the edge of something familiar that you cannot name, of recognizing a shape in the darkness that you have never been taught but somehow already know. It is the feeling that rises when you look at a photograph of a place you have never visited and feel not curiosity but homecoming. It is the feeling that settles when you hear a piece of music in a language you do not speak and understand it anyway. Not the words, but the weight, not the meaning, but the rhythm beneath the meaning. This is the return. Not a return to a specific place or a specific time, but a return to a pattern. The oldest pattern, the one that says what has happened before, will happen again. Not identically, not mechanically, but structurally. The way spring returns without repeating a single leaf. The deep past is not behind you. It is beneath you. It is the ground on which every subsequent layer of history has been deposited, and like all ground, it shapes what grows from it in ways that are invisible from the surface, but determinative at the root. The cities you live in are built on the same principles of drainage orientation and solar exposure that guided the placement of settlements 10,000 years ago. The calendars you follow are refinements of observational systems that tracked solstices and lunar phases long before any numeral was written. The roads you travel follow corridors of movement, river valleys, mountain passes, coastal plains that were walked by human feet for millennia before the first wheel turned. You are not living in a world that replaced the ancient one. You are living in a world that grew from it the way a tree grows from a root system that remains invisible but essential, drawing water and stability from depths that the canopy never sees. The return is visible in the things that have never changed. Bread is still made by mixing grain with water and applying heat, a process that has not altered in its essential chemistry since the first grain was cultivated in the foothills of the Fertile Crescent. Shelters are still built by stacking materials to resist gravity, wind and water, the same three forces that every builder in every age has contended with. Navigation still depends on the relationship between the observer and the horizon, whether the instrument is a sextant, a compass, a satellite, or the naked eye tracing the arc of a star from rise to set. These continuities are so fundamental that they become invisible, like the air in a room, present everywhere, noticed nowhere, essential always. The return is not dramatic. It is ambient. It surrounds you the way temperature surrounds you, felt without effort, shaping behavior without instruction. But the return is also visible in the things that do change, and then change back, cycling through variations on themes so old that the theme itself has become indistinguishable from nature. Civilizations rise and concentrate knowledge the way a river concentrates sediment at a delta, building up land grain by grain, until the delta extends beyond its own stability and the river finds a new channel. The old delta remains slowly subsiding, slowly compacting, becoming the substrate for future growth while the active current moves elsewhere. Egypt concentrated the knowledge of the deep past for 3,000 years, and then the current shifted to Greece, to Rome, to Baghdad, to the libraries of medieval Europe, to the workshops of the Renaissance, each inheritor receiving fragments, without receiving the whole, each building, on foundations laid by predecessors they only partially understood. The return is not the repetition of content, it is the repetition of process. Gathering, concentrating, expressing, dispersing, regathering. The river does not carry the same water twice, but it carves the same shapes into the same land, because the relationship between water and gravity does not change, and the relationship between knowledge and the conditions that support it does not change either. There is a return happening now that you can feel if you allow your attention to soften. The modern world, for all its noise and speed and relentless forward momentum, is beginning to circle back toward questions that the deep past asked first. How do we build structures that endure? How do we align our systems with natural cycles rather than against them? How do we preserve knowledge across disruptions that we know are coming but cannot precisely predict? How do we live within the limits of a planet that does not negotiate and does not forgive excess? These are not new questions. They are the oldest questions. They are the questions that the builders of Naphtali asked when they aligned their stones to the solstice. They are the questions that the surveyors of the Nile asked when they measured the flood and divided the land. They are the questions that every community that survived the end of the last ice age are answered not with theory but with practice, with the repeated patient, unglamorous work of observation, adaptation and transmission. The return is not a retreat to the past. It is a recognition that the past never fully departed, that its questions remain embedded in the conditions of existence itself, and that any civilization that ignores them long enough will eventually be forced to confront them again, not as academic curiosities but as survival imperatives. Let this recognition settle, not as anxiety, not as urgency, as familiarity. The feeling of the return is not the feeling of crisis. It is the feeling of coming home to a house you forgot you owned, finding the doors still on their hinges, the walls still plumb the roof, still shedding rain. The structure is sound. It was always sound. It was built by people who understood that soundness matters more than decoration, that alignment matters more than scale, that the work of endurance is quieter and less celebrated than the work of invention, but infinitely more necessary. You're returning to their understanding now, not because you have read it in a book or heard it in a lecture, but because the pattern itself is returning the way the tide returns, the way the season returns, the way the breath you are drawing now returns the air to your lungs in the same rhythm it has followed since the first breath you ever drew. The return does not ask for belief, it asks only for stillness. And in that stillness, it arrives familiar, patient, and as old as the stone beneath the oldest city on earth. There is nothing left to prove. The evidence has been laid down layer by layer, the way the earth itself lays down its record, not to persuade, not to convince, but simply to remain. The stones at Giza remain. The alignments at Nabta remain. The polygonal walls in the Andes remain. The buried pillars at Göbekli Tepe remain. The flood stories remain. The measurements remain. The silence remains. And you lying here in the quiet hours of a night that is no different in its essential darkness from any night that has passed over this planet in the last 100,000 years, you remain too. For now, for this breath, for the span of attention that separates waking from sleep, which is itself a kind of silence. The silence between one state of consciousness and another, the pause in which the mind releases its hold, on sequence, and allows itself simply to be held. What the deep past teaches, if it teaches anything, is not a fact, but a posture. It teaches the posture of acceptance, not resignation, not passivity, but the quiet recognition that human knowledge has always been partial, has always been fragile, has always depended on conditions beyond human control for its survival. The builders who aligned their monuments to stars they would never see shift did not build in despair. They built in understanding. They understood that their work would outlast their names. They understood that the knowledge they embedded in stone and angle and proportion would be inherited by people who might never know where it came from, and they built anyway. Not for credit, not for posterity in the modern sense of being remembered, for continuity, for the possibility that something essential would survive the next disruption, the next silence, the next long exhale of the earth that would rearrange the surface and scatter whatever had been gathered. This is not a sad understanding. It is a liberating one. If the deep past shows us anything, it shows us that loss is not the opposite of meaning. Loss is the medium through which meaning travels. Every fragment that survived the end of the last ice age, every alignment, every proportion, every ritual practiced without explanation survived because someone valued it enough to carry it forward, even when they could no longer explain why it mattered. The act of carrying is itself the meaning. The knowledge does not need to be complete to be valuable. It does not need to be understood to be preserved. It only needs to be practiced repeated-handed from one set of hands to the next, with the care that comes from recognizing that what you hold is older than you are, and will, if you are faithful to it, outlast you by millennia. Tonight, as your body settles deeper into rest and the boundaries between thought and dream begin to soften, like clay left in rain, consider that you are part of this chain, not as a builder of pyramids or an aligner of stones, but as a carrier of pattern. Every habit you maintain without questioning its origin is an echo of something older. Every rhythm you follow, the rhythm of meals, of sleep, of seasonal attention, of marking the passage of time, is a thread in a fabric woven so long ago that no one remembers the first weaver. You do not need to understand the pattern to be part of it. You only need to continue, the way stone continues, the way starlight continues, the way the breath you are drawing now continues the work of every breath that preceded it, each one a small act of maintenance, each one a quiet restoration of the balance that keeps you alive without asking for your conscious participation. The civilization before civilization did not vanish. It became quiet. It thinned to the width of a habit, the weight of a proportion, the angle of a shadow falling across a threshold at the precise moment of solstice. It is still present in every structure that orients itself to north, without knowing why north matters. It is still present in every calendar that marks the equinox without knowing why the equinox was sacred. It is still present in the impulse to build with care, to measure with precision, to align with something larger than the immediate need. These impulses are not modern inventions. They are inheritances so old that they have become instincts woven into the way human beings relate to space, to time, and to the quiet insistence of the earth that certain things be done in certain ways. Let this be the last thought before sleep takes you fully. You are not separate from the deep past. You are its continuation. The stone remembers, the sky remembers, and somewhere in the space between your last waking breath and your first sleeping one, you remember too, not with the mind, not with language, not with any faculty that can be named or measured, but with the body itself, which has been practicing the art of continuity since long before you were born, and which will carry that practice forward silently, faithfully into whatever comes next. The deep past does not ask to be understood. It asks only to be continued. And tonight, in your stillness, it is.